logistically, it wasn't obviously a straight 6-month trial. I mean, you broke it up.
Oh no, there were some recesses, and there were some hot moments. And there was one golden moment when David Reich was on the stand and said something, and suddenly Judge Weinman erupted and said, "That's a lie! I've read all these depositions, and I know that's not true. And here's the president of Rikes has just been called a liar by the judge in the case that he's sitting in." So there were a few explosive moments, as there are in every trial, but there were a lot of boring moments too, as there is in every.
What's good? Welcome to Retrial Podcast, where we decode legal history that happened in Dayton, Ohio. These cases, lawyers, and stories set the stage for present-day learning across our nation. Hosted by myself, Judge Gerald Parker, and attorney, friend, colleague,
Dave Greer, and you can tell us apart because he's the big ball player and I've just got a little ball player over here.
Dayton Dragons. We are representing the Dayton Dragons. For those of you who don't know, make sure you check out our Dragons. In this episode, we're going to discuss the antitrust case between department store giants Rikes and Beerman, how they left downtown for the suburbs and ultimately disappeared. Dave, you got to let us know what's going on during this time period. Rikes, for those that don't know, was apparently just a huge department store here in Dayton.
As was the Elder and Johnson Company. Rikes was, they were two giant department stores. What a golden, if you go past the flood and take the decade of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, things started to deteriorate in the middle of the 60s.
Right.
But downtown Dayton was just absolutely alive with human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And excitement. We had theaters everywhere, we had restaurants everywhere, and we had these two giant department stores. Rikes was right where the Schuster Center is now on 2nd Street in Maine. It originally went almost to Ludlow Street. There was the Miami Hotel down at the corner. They tore down that hotel and added it to Rikes. It was a big department store. You could buy anything you wanted. They had restaurants. Sales clerks knew their stuff. I mean, if you wanted somebody that knew everything there was about ladies' hats or gloves, right, there she was. And the Elder and Johnson Company was the other big department store in town, down where the Rybold, they were in the Rybold building down at 4th and Main Streets. And Robert Elder was the kingpin of that organization until his death. And it's hard to imagine how thriving and alive downtown Dayton was. There were no suburbs, there were no shopping centers anywhere, and everybody shopped downtown.
Yeah.
Everybody went to the Colonial Theater, which had vaudeville plus a movie, and the Keith's Theater was the big one in town on 4th Street, same thing. State Theater. Right behind Rikes, where there's now just a parking lot, was Lowe's Theater, which was one of those beautiful old-fashioned movie houses.
Wow.
Just a delightful city before things spread out.
Wow.
And if you're going to buy anything, you came downtown to buy it, and
Yeah.
you came to Rikes.
And Dayton at that time was the retail capital of the Midwest at that time, right?
It was a big deal, yeah.
And then Arthur Beerman enters the scene. What's going on here between these two before we kind of get into the true players? But is there a competition going on or what?
Well, there is, but it's an uneven competition, which the lawsuit we're going to end up finding ourselves involved in was designed to do something about that. But if you want to start with the players a little bit, let's.
Before we do that, I want to ask you something, because we're going to be talking about antitrust. I know what it is, you know what it is, but can you kind of explain to us, when we hear antitrust, it sounds bad, it sounds anti, and then you hear trust. So obviously something's wrong, something's being done untrustworthy. Just in a general speaking, and then we add business involved and big conglomerates, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But what exactly is antitrust before we get into the players here?
Well, there's a variety of antitrust issues, but the main one, and the main one here, is the attempt to monopolize a certain area of products. We had it just before the flood in the great NCR antitrust case. Maybe we'll talk about that someday. But it was to make sure there wasn't going to be anybody else in the world selling cash registers except the National Cash Register Company, and they did all sorts of stuff to make that happen. In this case, the antitrust issue was Rikes had all the good stuff, and they had what they call exclusive dealing arrangements with. There were 76 defendants along with Rikes when we get to the lawsuit.
And 76, I presume, are the suppliers to Rikes.
Right, and they're the ones that have all the best shirts, that have the best pants, that have all the labels that everybody wants to have, the best anything you'd buy in a department store. If you wanted the top of the line, you had to get it at Rikes because you couldn't get it anyplace else. And the reason you couldn't get it anyplace else is they had what they call exclusive dealing agreements, that we will buy all our product from you and you won't sell any of your product to anybody else. And that's the crux of the case that ended up in a 6-month trial.
Understood. There's a markup too in prices, is that right?
Well, one of the joys of the department store business, if you've got an exclusive dealing, you can get whatever markup you want, which when we get down to what happened with department store type sales and all the changes that occurred and are still occurring, back in the old days, they could get a 35% markup on what they could and make a lot of money.
Well, how'd you get involved in this?
I got involved in this because I was engaged by Federated Department Stores in this lawsuit. I was also engaged by the daughters of Robert Elder in another suit against that Beerman had. Beerman was, the Bar Association always wanted to give Arthur Beerman a big award as being the best thing for lawyers that ever happened in the city of Dayton, because he was a litigious guy. He didn't mind filing a suit. Right. And
well,
he was good for business, let's put it that
way. I bet. Good for billing, huh?
Indeed.
So I want to ask, well, we're going to talk about the players. Robert Elder specifically, David Reich, Arthur Beerman, and we'll talk about Bill Gillum as well. Robert Elder, corporate lawyer, big money guy. Let's start with him. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Robert Elder was the head of the old Elder and Johnson Company, was there for a million years. It was a big money maker. World War II, of course, everybody had a lot of money because we had a lot of industry going on in Dayton for the war.
Right.
And wars are good for business, unfortunately. Made a lot of money. The government put ceilings on salaries that people would have. Robert Elder figured out a way around that, so that he took his salary in the form of a percentage of what the store's profits were, which when the profits were soaring was pretty good. And every year, in a gesture of generosity, he plowed some of that money that he otherwise would have taken as a salary back into the business.
Oh, of course.
Kind-hearted man. Dave Reich was an old Dayton family, been in the dry goods business since the century before, and he developed Reich's department store. Ultimately, it gets acquired by Federated Department Stores, which is a big department store chain.
Right.
And by the time of the lawsuit, the suit is Federated rather than Reich's. The really interesting personality in this triumvirate is Arthur Beerman. Beerman was a short, immaculately dressed, stocky, aggressive, ambitious, and impressive businessman. Like a lot of Dayton lawyers and businessmen, he had his own table at the King Cole Bar, which was the bar of choice for the upper class, right, at the corner of 2nd and Ludlow Streets. And every night at 5 o'clock in those days when it was martini lunches and booze at 5, the same people would assemble into the same chairs in the old King Cole.
You say martini lunches?
Oh, yeah, those days there was a lot of drinking done in the business world. And a lot of night, you could deduct entertainment expenses. So there was nightlife everywhere, from the Mayfair Burlesque on Fifth Street, where the convention center is, to all sorts of dance halls and nightclubs.
Right.
But Arthur comes to Dayton right after World War II, 1945. And he starts with a little store at the corner of 3rd and William Street, over the river in the west side of Dayton. And that's where he gets his start, 1945. A couple of years later, he opens the McCook Shopping Center, which is another downtown, kind of nothing left of it these days, but that was the first shopping center in Dayton. I think 1947 he opened that.
So is he inching himself closer to Rikes?
Closer and closer and closer.
And I'm assuming Reich is feeling that.
Oh, yeah. But he's fighting them with one hand tied behind his back, as happens to some of us from time to time, and, because he can't get the merchandise to really compete with him. He, in, I think, 1956, he moves downtown and opens up a thing he calls the Home Store, which is kind of a low-end department store. It was a wraparound of the American Building at the corner, the southeast corner of 3rd and Main Streets. So there was an entrance on 3rd Street and an entrance around the corner on Main Street. Mm-hmm. And the store was a kind of a wraparound. And there he is, 1956. Now we're inching our way into the big department store world. At that point, Robert Elder has died. His son-in-law, Tom Marshall, has become the president of the Elder and Johnson Company. Mm-hmm. Tom's a real fine gentleman. He's a lawyer. He was with the firm of Marshall and Smith, Gene Smith, who any lawyers listening to this will remember that name.
Okay.
Because Gene was probably the most difficult lawyer we ever had in town. But Tom ended up being the president of the Elder and Johnson Company, which all the family stock was spread out among the relatives of Robert Elder. Mm-hmm. And Arthur wanted to buy into that business. I took Tom Marshall's deposition twice, once in this antitrust suit and once in the suit that Beerman filed against Elder's daughters, who were getting a pension plan payment ever since Robert died. He had two homes. One was in Key West, Florida. One was in Harbor Springs, Michigan. The deposition we took of him in Key West, Florida, was taken in August, when it was hotter than blazes down there. That was in the girls' case. And we got locked off in the Miami airport, I recall, with the court reporter and Beerman's lawyer, who was a character too, and myself, all sharing a single room. And then we go down to Key West to take the deposition.
Tough life.
And then the one in Harbor Springs, Michigan, was in January in a blizzard. Why he was in Michigan in the winter and in Key West in the summer, he never explained to me. But he told exactly the same story both times. And that was Beerman would come to him and said, I would like to buy into the Elder and Johnson Company. I want to get into the big-time department store business. And Tom said, fine, I'm not in love with this forever. So he turns over all the financial records over, and Beerman spends a year with his accountants and so forth, looking at all this stuff. And then he finally comes in to Marshall's office and makes him an offer. And the offer is so low that Marshall just blows up at him, says, you SOB, mm-hmm. I never want to see you again. Get out of my office. Don't ever talk to me. Don't call me. Don't send me letters. You're out of here. Flat out. Kicked out. And about a year later, Tom comes to work in the morning, and there's Arthur Beerman. And he says, you SOB, flavor the words however you think they probably were uttered. And I told you never to come back here. And he says, well, I think you may want to talk to me now. Because in the past year, I have gone among all of the heirs of Robert Elder, and I now own 51% of this company.
Oh, man.
And Tom, one thing about Arthur Beerman that was proven in this case and in every other case of anyone who ever dealt with him, the man was terribly difficult to make a deal with. But if you made a deal, the deal was solid gold. He would never welch on a deal. And Tom Marshall was always amazed that Arthur paid him for his stock the same amount he paid all those people that gave him the stock that gave him the 51%.
Wow.
So now Arthur is in the department store catbird seat. He's now running the Elder and Johnson Company, which is going to become Elder Beerman. And so what's left for him to do? Well, he'd like to be selling the real stuff because it's all being sold at Rikes.
Right.
So that's the birth of this antitrust suit. And so he sues Federated, which is Rikes, and he sues 76 of the suppliers who are supplying stuff to it. He sues a couple of the distributing and other arms of Federated, AMC and AWC, which are the companies I represent in the litigation.
Gotcha.
And the case goes on. It is a showcase, and it turned out to be just like a circus for the lawyers.
Well,
I think there were 400 depositions taken.
That's insane.
And we're going all over the place. Of course, all these retired department store type people, they go down to Florida and spend their time. So we would spend weeks down in Florida and take depositions every morning and then go to the Everglades or fool around in the afternoon.
Well, yeah, I heard 70 plus defendants, and if that case is coming to my docket and coming before me, I'm just pulling what little hair I have out, because I don't know how in the world 5 or 6 attorneys can represent 70 plus defendants in this.
And then you add to that not only the antitrust exclusive dealing case, but you add up what they call Robinson-Patman claims against my clients, and you've got an almost impossible mess to untangle. Fortunately, the 76 defendants, there are only 3 or 4 lawyers who are representing all of those people, so it's not that bad. But it saved my life. I think it was 1967 when the case was going to trial. My mother and father died both about the same time. My father was, I was in his law office. So I had inherited all of his caseload, a lot of which was in the federal court. And here comes this trial that is going to involve what they estimate accurately as being a 6-month trial with all these issues to unravel. And Judge Weinman, on the Friday before the trial, severs the Robinson-Patman claims out of the trial.
How does he do that?
So I missed the 6-month trial, except in the playback at night from Bill Gillum, who will tell you a little bit about what that trial was really like.
Let's talk about Bill Gillum, one of the players involved, and tell us a little bit about Bill Gillum.
Bill's quite a character and good trial lawyer, good friend. He was with a big Washington firm. He and a guy named Bruce Montgomery are the ones that came up from that firm to try the case with the old seasoned partner in the firm, who Bill will tell you a little bit about on tape.
Okay.
But Bill was a Washington lawyer, Virginian, very good Virginia accent to him, very precise kind of a guy. When he first started being shipped to Dayton to try this case, he said, "Oh my God, you come to Dayton, you got to turn your clock back 100 years." And but he ends up falling in love with Dayton and joining the Smith and Schnocky firm here as their key trial lawyer, and off he goes into a Dayton trial lawyer.
And he's heavily involved in this case, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's hear from Bill Gillum here for a second and hear what he has to say about this whole thing.
Yeah, I think he'll have some stories to tell you.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is there's a great moment when John Henry, local bar fame, is cross-examining a man named Andrew Hallam. Hallam John thought, was a very friendly witness. He calls him on his case. And he had a deposition answer that John liked. And he said, "Mr. Hallam, tell us what you think of exclusives, and the issue was exclusives. Federated having a pile of exclusive, and Beerman saying this is an antitrust violation. Hallam said from the stand, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm going to tell you that exclusives are the worst possible thing that can happen to you, because you know what? You have to pay more for everything that the Federated stores have an exclusive on, and they got a ton of exclusive, and they went on to explain it, why this is such a good, a bad thing, and why he was very pleased to have the opportunity to tell this to the jury. At the end of the day, the journalist came up to Bill McGovern, who was the senior partner on the case, and said, in essence, what the hell happened. And McGovern said, well, Mr. Henry asked one question too many. Basically, the lesson was lead, don't ask the open-ended question. And obviously, it'd be useful if you knew where the witness was coming out. That was one of the great moments. I did get Arthur Beerman to state under oath that he had lied, and he had done it for a business purpose. And, you know, as far as the jury was concerned, they might as well say, well, what's wrong with that? So, Wyman was very interesting, though. He didn't ever have a court reporter come to the bench, so you weren't able to preserve these moments of insight that he would give you.
Judge Canary up in Columbus used to do that. He'd drag everybody up to the bench and just castigate them, and it would never be on the record.
Yeah, well, Wyman did the same. He must have learned it from Canary some way, but I thought, where is the court reporter when I'm making a record on this point? But there were so many things. I mean, as you and I have talked about it, because you abandoned ship and took all your 76 defendants and didn't sit in the courtroom. And one of the great theories of the law, how did Mr. Greer and his brilliant lawyer get these people out of this case? Well, his argument very simply was, there's no room in the courtroom, Judge, for all these people. Judge said, you're right. Separated the case.
That's wild. So
what's he to Hecuba? This is kind of the battle cry. The case goes down the drain. I think Bill told the story of the juror who lit
cigarette.
The cigarette for the guy.
Tell us about that.
The old federal courthouse, the bankruptcy court is over there now. It was the post office, the Dayton post office at the time, the ground floor. Second floor was the federal court. And unfortunately, the courtroom is over here, and the main aisle separates it from the rooms over that are over here. And one of those rooms is the jury room, so that every time there's a recess in the case, everybody goes out into the hall from the courtroom, and here's the jury room right across the hall. So it's a kind of not exactly a security.
If that happened today, I'd lose my mind. That would not be a possibility.
Well, and when they built this courthouse, the Common Pleas Courthouse, they were very careful to have the side corridors so that the jury and the clients don't mix and mingle. But the case ends up with a verdict against Federated.
Wow.
For all these tie-ins.
A lot of money, wasn't it?
And we had a lot of money, and it was a confusing amount of money because nobody could figure out an award in a case like that is supposed to be damages times 3. Mm-hmm. And nobody could figure out whether the jury had done the multiplication or whether the judge was supposed to multiply their award by 3. So off it goes to the Court of Appeals, and it finally gets settled and it disappears. But as it's disappearing, so is a way of life in the department store world.
Right. Let me ask you about that, because this trial, what happens after the settlement? I mean, I'm assuming Rikes obviously is threatened. It goes to court. Beerman wins, goes back on appeal, and then they eventually settle it during that time period. Two parties have to think about what they want to do next, right? And Rikes apparently has essentially just thrown up their hands and gone the other direction? Or what happens? What does Rikes say? Like, what is the discussions that happen?
Well, we're now getting into the 70s when shopping centers are starting to develop. All the executives at NCR are building the Dayton Mall, and the Salem Mall is being built north of town. And people are, downtown is kind of drying up. We're doing a lot of redevelopment. They're tearing down a lot of the monuments of downtown. Those theaters I were talking about, they're all starting to disappear. People are moving out into the suburbia, and the shopping is following them. And they've discovered if you've got these big shopping malls,
Right.
you can drive a giant truck into them a little easier than you can into downtown Dayton,
Right.
and just pour the stuff into the shopping establishment, and you can make as much money on a 13% markup as you could on a 30% markup. So it's that whole suburban slide is changes the whole complexion of the business. Just when this is all going on, of course, Dave Reich is making public announcements that Reichs will never leave downtown Dayton, and so off we go, and everybody heads south.
I want to go back a little bit to the trial, though, like the actual litigation leading up to it. And can you tell us a little bit about what was going on during that? I mean, obviously 400 depositions. I got to hear how this pans out, because I don't know a judge that wants to look through all that.
Yeah, nobody would. I mean, it's total insanity, and the whole buildup was total insanity because everybody felt they had to depose everybody that was in the purchasing department at Rikes at any time.
Were these depositions all over the United States, or where were you headed out to?
They were everywhere, although clustered more in Florida, where retirees were, than other spots. Some in New York, where people are still active.
Right.
But we had this little army of warriors that would go out and take all these depositions. Jerry Goldman was Beerman's lawyer, a short little guy from Cincinnati, just as aggressive as Arthur. They were the closest of friends. Jerry was married to a very wealthy woman, and apparently there was never a bill that was exchanged between lawyer and client. At the end of each year, the story was that Jerry Goldman and Arthur Beerman would sit down, and they'd look over what had happened in the past year. If business wasn't going too good, Jerry's wife would loan Arthur some money. Business was going real good, Arthur would pay a big legal fee. It was an interesting relationship. And of course, we've got this little army that's going around taking all these depositions. I'm part of that army, as is Leo in my office. And a lot of the suppliers are represented by Stan Friedman, who was with Smith & Schnocky.
I've heard that name over and over around this.
Stan was a wonderful guy, very, very funny fella. Wrote all the gridiron scripts for the Bar Association when we had these annual parties. And in fact, that deposition of Tom Marshall that we took up in Harbor Springs in a blizzard, we all got snowed in, and we were trapped in Traverse City, Michigan in a hotel for 3 days for one deposition. And so it turned into quite a party. Everybody made up songs about Arthur Beerman, and lawyers are human beings, and they behave like human beings from time to time. So it was quite a holiday. And then it all comes to this trial, and trying to find jurors who are willing to sit there for 6 months. It's just outrageous. But it took 6 months to do it, and while that was going on, the whole world of commercial sales was changing.
How was the layout for the trial? Because when I tell jurors that this trial is going to be longer than 4 days, 5 days, or going to next week, I can already see their faces. Logistically, it wasn't obviously a straight 6-month trial. I mean, you broke it up.
Oh no, there were some recesses, and there were some hot moments. Bill, I'm sure, has told you about the cross-examination of Mr. Hallam, who was a witness who sank the ship. And there was one golden moment when David Reich was on the stand and said something, and suddenly Judge Weinman erupted and said, "That's a lie! I've read all these depositions, and I know that's not true. And here's the president of Reichs has just been called a liar by the judge in the case that he's sitting in." So there were a few explosive moments, as there are in every trial, but there were a lot of boring moments too, as there is in every trial.
You described Robert Landis, one of the attorneys involved, and I presume this is the same way with some of the other parties, that Landis was less of a guide to his clients than a fabricator of his clients' dreams. he was the ideal lawyer for the client who wants to know how to do what he wants to do rather than to be counseled what he cannot or should not do. How was that reined in? And that's just something that I've always heard, undersell, overperform. And then there's attorneys that will not tell clients what they want to hear, and some will tell them what they do want to hear, and that could always cause, friction here and there in the end. With these cast of characters involved, like, did you have to maneuver what you told folks, what you didn't, and listening to what they were saying?
Well, Mr. Landis was an office lawyer. Mm-hmm. He was not a trial lawyer.
Okay.
And his role, as described, really was in part that thing I said about how do you get around the ceilings of prices, and the other was that there was only one pension plan in the whole Elder and Johnson company, which provided not a nickel for any employee, but provided a life pension after Elder's death for his widow, and then after the widow dies to his two daughters. And when Arthur bought the company, he decided, and probably correctly, that that's outrageous. That's not a pension plan. That's a family trust, for God's sake.
Yeah,
it was other people's money. And so that was that lawsuit. I represented the daughters of Elder in that thing. And the outcome was, yeah, Arthur, it was really a bad thing, but it was there, and you saw it when you bought the company, so you bought the trust. Mm-hmm. Yep. And the girls came out just fine.
Dave, I want to talk about something you've described as the trauma of change, this mindset of not being willing to change or adapt to what's coming down the road, to the future. We've heard stories about like Kodak. Where's Kodak? I remember growing up, Kodak films, they're not around anymore. And Rikes was obviously unsuccessful in this regard. Is there anything that you believe they could have done? What should they have done? What they did obviously didn't work, except it was reversed on appeal, and then there was a settlement. So what do you think would have made this, made it amicable for everybody?
Well, that's why we have all these mediations that we fool with now to take your business away from you in the courthouse.
I appreciate the mediation department.
I guess if you step back, every dispute, there's certainly certain odds of winning or losing. And trial lawyers are kind of a combined bookie and warrior.
Right.
In other words, we're retained to try to give you some counsel as to what we think the odds of winning or losing are going to be if you go to court and it goes all the way out.
Well, can you tell me what you were telling your clients, and then we'll talk about what Rikes maybe should have been doing?
Well, I got the soft touch because mine got put off, and we never went to trial. True. I mean, the whole thing got worn out. Kind of like in the desegregation case, when it was first filed, it had a count that was county-wide. And they were trying to make an argument that the generals at the Air Force Base could send their kids to Oakwood High School, whereas nobody else could, especially if you were black.
Right.
But everybody was so worn out after 10 years of litigation, they never got around to it. And in the Beerman case, everybody was so worn out over the antitrust case that was tried that nobody wanted to waste their money into the one that didn't have to try. So I didn't have to do much of a bookie. But no matter what odds were given to Rikes and Federated on the antitrust case, the choice is always the client's.
Right.
Do I want to take that chance or don't I? And businessmen make their money in business, and sometimes being what they call a porcupine, so the don't touch me or you're going to get stung, is a tactic that's followed.
It's always a risk, right?
Well, there's always a risk.
There's always a risk.
And there's always a potential benefit, whether it's a little benefit or not. And time goes on and things change. And, Shakespeare always had that wonderful line about how golden lads and girls all must, like chimney sweepers, come to dust.
Right.
And that's what happened to these businesses, too.
What's that?
Rikes did turn to dust, got imploded. The building is gone and the business is gone.
Right. What do you think they could have done differently?
Again, I don't know. The sensible thing to do would be to work out an arrangement that would permit Beerman to have the other people then make a business decision. of do you follow everybody to the suburbs? That's what was happening in the business world.
Yeah.
Just as right now, all the big box stores are drying up because you can get it
Right.
with this fleet of Amazon trucks come roaring down the highway every day.
So before we get there, so where's Arthur Beerman after all of this? Like, what's he after he comes at Rikes and is able to resolve this dispute and getting ready to head to the suburbs? Like, what changes? What do you see from Arthur Beerman?
Well, Arthur Beerman had several things happen to him. One that's kind of interesting is the Elder's store didn't own the building. It was the Rybold building. That's one of those family trust things that had 1 million people owning it. So he moves out of the Rybold building and has a new store that's down by Courthouse Square in downtown Dayton. He was also got all involved in the redevelopment of downtown Dayton, and whether the I-75 was going to go on this side or the other side of the river and all this kind of stuff. Rikes had a parking garage, which is still there across the street from it, a favorite jumping off place for suicides. But he always wanted a bridge across Ludlow Street from that parking garage. That's what Arthur Beerman ultimately got 1 block south of there, because he built a new Elder Beerman store on Courthouse Square with a parking garage that had an overpass where you could walk from your car into the store. So that rivalry just continued, although Reich dragged his feet as far as going to the suburbs, and Arthur went right to the suburbs. But even there, ultimately, it wasn't successful. Nothing lasts forever. The golden businesses all turn to dust at some point.
Yeah. Have you seen that with businesses these days not willing to change and causing them to fall?
Oh, yeah, you see it all the time. Yeah. In fact, there's a wonderful little book from 1923 by Joe Schartz, who was a socialist lawyer in Dayton, talking about, which is on the whole thing of a socialist history of Dayton up to 1920. And here's the parade of businesses that no longer exist. You know, where are they now? Where are they now?
Yeah. So I loved and still do love going to the mall. There's still the Dayton Mall there. It's still present. Elder Beerman, shockingly, is not there anymore. But I love taking my daughters to the mall. They love it. And running around. There's still something about going to the mall that I enjoy. But things have changed now. We're not going to the malls as much anymore. They're shutting down. There's these new outdoor malls. Here we have the Green, and there's some other places in Columbus, like Easton, where they're kind of outdoor malls spread out for folks to walk around. Like I said, the Green has come around, and things are just changing in how we are buying goods. And when Rikes falls and then Elder Beerman, essentially, which closed down, I believe, in 2018, I don't know where we're headed next, aside from just online and buying everything online. When you talked about a specialist who was specializing in perfume and gloves and things at the mall, I mean, we're far from that these days.
Yeah, you don't have those kind of salespeople at the Walmart.
Those salespeople, we don't have those anymore. So what's been the effect of leaving for the suburbs?
Well, I know everybody that's listening in on us, assuming there is somebody listening in on us, is going to have that same experience. You can't fight change. Change just happens. We almost lost NCR when they thought they could continue to make mechanical cash registers till the end of civilization. And whoa, they finally woke up, boy, there's this computer stuff. It's a whole different game.
Yeah. The Salem Mall also, you talked a little about the Salem Mall and how that branched out and now it's no longer.
It was a big deal. And you look at all these malls and it's kind of like the old Indian slash and burn form of you burn out an area of the forest and you plant stuff there, and then when that ground dies, you burn out another area. One mall goes up and another one goes down, and we've had that kind of cycle going on.
Yeah.
The Salem Mall was a big deal. Yeah. Now it's rubble.
And you see any other, as far as antitrust goes, I mean, we can just go straight to Amazon right now. I mean, what we're seeing, that van lives in my neighborhood all week long. In fact, I mean, it shows up nonstop, 24/7. It's my wife's fault, basically. It's not mine. But there's the van is there.
Well, I live over in the Oregon district, and those big vans, they take up the whole damn street. So you
I was told that they're buying up nonstop just vans, vehicles, trucks, and they don't even have the smile on them anymore. Just people just working for Amazon, and they're just dropping off goods for everybody.
It's amazing, and I guess all you can say is change is going to happen, and you have to live with it. I mean, that's the world has a way of just changing all the time.
Yeah.
The only thing that remains the same are the human beings that live in it.
That's true. That is true. That is true. So Arthur Beerman, of course, just seems like a fascinating individual. You've spent a lot of time on him because obviously he was just somebody that you gravitated towards, and you have a lot of stories about.
There are plenty of stories about him. And he was a fascinating guy, interesting guy, smart as a whip, impossible to cross-examine. I cross-examined him in a trial of the elder daughter's pension case. And I also took his deposition in the antitrust case. And every time, no matter what question you asked him, the answer was going to take half an hour, and it was going to have absolutely nothing to do with the question. And you see the New York style of cross-examination. I want a yes or no answer.
Right.
And that doesn't work in the Midwest, and I'm not sure it ever worked anywhere, because then the lawyer turns out to be the jerk, and the witness is kind of the innocent victim tied to the stake. And even the best New York lawyer couldn't have forced Arthur into a yes or no answer on anything. Right. And I always figured that the most effective way to handle those kind of witnesses, it's like deep sea fishing. If you hook into a marlin, you don't just drag that damn thing into the boat. You got to let it run. And you let it run, and it jumps, and it flops around, and it's exciting, and you see all that action. And then at some point, you finally sink the hook and drag it in. Yeah. And that's the same way with cross-examining Arthur Beerman. I mean, you'd throw him the bait, and he'd run and jump and go all over the place and tell you 1,000 stories that had nothing to do with anything. And then at the end, now the question was, blah, blah, blah. And so you had that with him. The other thing was, if he was wounded, he would react to it. Right. When he decided he was going to put his new Elder Beerman store downtown, that meant he was going to vacate the Rybold building with the old Elder and Johnson or Elder Beerman store.
Right.
So when he left, when you leave a place that you've taken on a lease, you can take with you all your leasehold stuff. Mm-hmm. But if there's anything that is part of the real estate, that becomes what they call a fixture, and it belongs to the building. So Arthur considered that the escalators in the Rybold building were not fixtures. Mm-hmm. They belonged to the building. So when he left the Rybold building, he took the escalators, and he sent somebody, and they took every light bulb out of the building.
That's savage there. Savage.
But treat me right, and you got gold. Treat me wrong, you got trouble. That was Arthur.
You can read more about Rikes and Elder Beerman antitrust lawsuit in David's book, Slough of History's Boot Soles. Next episode, be sure to subscribe to. We thank you all for listening. And on the next episode of Retrial Podcast, we learn about the go-to lawyer from Dayton from 1896 to 1923, John McMahon. It's going to be a lot of fun. This Dayton Bar Association and Dayton Bar Foundation project was funded in part by a grant from the Dayton Legal Heritage Foundation of the Dayton Foundation, and by a grant from Jack W. and Sally D. Eichelberger Foundation of the Dayton Foundation. Thank you all.
And I do want to make some amendment here. He keeps referring to this book, The Slough of History's Boot Soles. I apologize for that, because that's probably the most off-putting title ever added to a book. It's from Walt Whitman, who talks about the real thing in life. It's not the stuff up in the air, it's the stuff on the street where you pick up the dirt.
Yeah, I didn't know what the heck you were talking about, man. This is a 6-episode pilot podcast, and with your support, we can find funding for future episodes. Support us by subscribing, leaving a review, and commenting.